Hello, and welcome to Insomnia TV. Tonight, I thought we would try something a little bit different. I wanted to get away from the dark, gritty, unsolved murders and take a look at this iceberg chart that I found a while back. It's called the Most Obscure Conspiracy Theories Iceberg. This was compiled by Reddit user Truth is Scarier. When I seen it, I thought it was kinda neat, and I just really wanted to cover it. A lot of these are super obscure, and I haven't heard of most of them. Some of them are completely absurd, which I love, while some of them sound like they were just made up. For a lot of them, I could barely find any info. Luckily, the Reddit user that posted the iceberg was able to share some info about the conspiracies. I will also be giving them a believability score, between 1 and 5 for each conspiracy, 5 being the most believable, 1 being absolutely no chance of being true. Part 1 for this series is going to be Layer 1 and Layer 2. If you guys like the video and want to see me finish this iceberg, let me know in the comments below. Starting with, MJ triple-double streak was to pay off gambling debts conspiracy. I have to believe almost everyone has heard of Michael Jordan. But in the unlikelihood you don't know who he is, he's a former basketball player who basically dominated the NBA in the 90s. During his time, he was lauded as the greatest player of all time. If you are too young to remember him, the most common comparison would be that of LeBron James now. Jordan was all that then. He was so popular that he even had a starring role in the blockbuster animated film Space Jam. But every legend always has a weakness, and Jordan's was gambling. He admitted he had to cover $57,000 in gambling losses in 1992, and during the playoffs in 1993, he was spotted gambling before a game with the Knicks. He also lost $1.25 million on the golf course. He was just absolutely addicted to gambling. And at the end of the 1993 season, Jordan abruptly retired from basketball and then decided to play minor league baseball. This started a conspiracy rumor in itself that the NBA had quietly suspended Jordan a year from the league due to gambling on his own games. This has been denied repeatedly by the NBA, but this is what leads to our conspiracy. In the 1989 season, Jordan had a streak of 7 games with a triple-double. If you don't know what that is, it's simply having double digits in 3 different statistical categories, such as having 10 points, 11 rebounds, 10 assists, etc., all in one game. It happens more often these days, but it didn't happen as much back in the 80s due to the style of play. Jordan not only done this 7 games straight, but in these 7 games, he would be seen going over to the scorer's table and asking them what he needed to do to reach a triple-double. This is very unusual, and you never see players doing this. This has led to the theory that Jordan was already having gambling problems by the 89 season, and he made a bet with a bookie, or someone, that he could have a triple-double so many games in a row. So what's the believability rating I give this one? I give it a 5. I think this is one of the more reasonable theories out there, and it could easily have been true. James Garfield was purposely killed by his doctors conspiracy. James Garfield was the 20th President of the United States, and served a very short tenure of 6 months. 2 of those months, he lay in a hospital slowly succumbing to a gunshot wound, after his assassin, Charles J. Guiteau, shot him at the Baltimore and Potomac Railroad Station. Guiteau, who may have had a mental illness, falsely believed he played a major role in Garfield getting elected. He felt that he should have been rewarded a consulship, and so he applied for one to serve in Vienna and Paris. His application was rejected by the Garfield administration, and it deeply offended Guiteau, so he would then try to assassinate Garfield. However, it's been widely attested to by modern doctors that the shot in the back would have easily been survivable. And what really killed Garfield was the doctors poking and probing the wound with unwashed hands and non-sterilized instruments. Guiteau would even go on to say at his trial, quote, "Yes, I shot the president, but his physicians killed him," end quote. And this is where the conspiracy comes in. Did the doctors purposely kill Garfield? The head doctor treating Garfield was a man named Dr. Willard Bliss. And let me point out, his real name was Doctor. That was not his title. His parents actually named him Doctor. And maybe this had something to do with his ego, as he would later go on to become a real doctor, and he would continually insist that he was in charge of Garfield's recovery, in spite of the fact he was mostly wrong on everything. There was even an account where Alexander Graham Bell brought in his newly devised metal detector, made specifically to save the president, to try and locate the bullet inside Garfield's body. Bliss would only let Bell scan his right side, because that's where he was convinced the bullet was. Not surprisingly, Dr. Bliss was wrong, but his ego couldn't allow Bell to locate the bullet elsewhere, And not only was Bliss about a foot off from where the bullet was really located, he would discover it was safely encased in his abdomen and would likely not have killed him. Bliss was also shocked at the amount of septic infection inside the president's body. Bliss was a man that was lucky to live before the internet, because his career would have been ruined much sooner, and he wouldn't have had the chance to even work with the president. Early on in the Civil War, he was known to have fled the battlefield and left wounded soldiers to die instead of treating them, because of his own cowardice. He would be appointed superintendent of a veterans hospital by Lincoln later on. Lincoln then would be treated at that same hospital on the night that he was shot, and in spite of Bliss being the boss of every doctor in the hospital and being the so-called ballistics trauma expert, he was pushed to the side by more qualified doctors and watched history unfold from the sideline. It was probably this reason he was so insistent on being the one in charge during Garfield's ordeal. Bliss was also hesitant to believe in this new movement of surgery, proposed by a man named Dr. Joseph Lister. You know, the same guy they named Listerine after. He proposed that in surgery, every piece of equipment should be sterilized, along with the hands being super clean before touching the wound. Some theorized that he refused to go along with this new medical advice because he had been embarrassed earlier in his career when he supported homeopathy, which is a pseudoscientific system of alternative medicine, which got him kicked out of the District of Columbia Medical Society. But having said all that, it still sounds unintentional, like it was caused by an inept egomaniac, not someone who murdered Garfield on purpose. I was only able to find a couple things that could give this theory merit. 1. In 1863, Bliss got busted accepting a $500 bribe, which is about $12,000 in today's money, for using a certain inventor's stove in a hospital over better options, as well as he got expelled from Washington, D.C. Medical Society for trying to sell Kundarango, which is a bark of a South American vine, as a, quote, wonderful remedy for cancer, syphilis, scrofula, ulcer, and all other chronic blood diseases, end quote. Most absurd of all, he submitted a bill of $25,000, about $700,000 in today's money, to the U.S. government for services rendered after Garfield died. He was then offered $6,500, or about $190,000 in today's money, to which he refused. Lastly, Candace Millard points out in her book, Destiny of the Republic, A Table of Madness, Medicine, and the Murder of a President, that the wounded president caused a behind-the-scene power struggle. I give this one a rating of 2. Of course, Dr. Bliss was an idiot, and most likely an egomaniac, and he wasn't exactly against taking a bribe or being a snake oil salesman. It is possible that in the power struggle behind the scenes, that someone could have paid Bliss to kill the president, but this doesn't seem likely, as the president lived 80 days after the gunshot, amongst what amounts to being tortured by Bliss. If he was purposely trying to kill him, he would have done it much sooner. Plus, after Garfield's death, Bliss's reputation never recovered. Disney fakes ticket sales conspiracy. This theory alleges that Disney faked ticket sales for a Captain Marvel movie that allegedly didn't do well. Supposedly, the movie done so bad that Disney bought up all the extra tickets at theaters, just so it wouldn't look bad on Disney. As far as sources and data go to back this theory up, well, there's not really any, other than some random Twitter accounts, such as Comics Division, who tweeted, quote, I went Thursday night, and the theater was little over half full, end quote. Another Twitter user noted, quote, the Captain Marvel report from my local theater is shocking. Out of 22 showings on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, there are more than 570 empty seats from advanced ticket buyers who never showed up. While on Sunday, there were only 4 no-shows for the movie all day, end quote. In a following tweet, user just_Pele said, quote, the manager claimed he had never seen anything like this in over 20 years. Hundreds and hundreds of tickets were purchased online, but the buyers never arrived to watch the film. As far as I'm concerned, the box office totals for Captain Marvel are fake, with Disney or a partner padding the numbers, end quote. It should be noted this user, just_Pele, has since been suspended from Twitter. Bounding into comics.com claimed to have spoke to an anonymous theater manager who said, quote, exactly 25 no-shows for every showing of Captain Marvel on Thursday through Saturday. It's definitely not normal. People usually show up when they pay for tickets. I'm not sure what it is. We've seen big groups not show up before, but they get refunds. I would say it's someone trying to make the ticket sales look better than they really were, end quote. One thing to remember about this movie though, was the controversy around the lead actress, Brie Larson, who made comments like, quote, I don't need a 40-year-old white dude to tell me what didn't work about A Wrinkle in Time, end quote. or things like calling for more diversity in the film press that covers their projects. Saying all this in a politically charged time like she did led to many fans planning to boycott the movie, along with trying to bombard sites like Rotten Tomatoes with negative reviews in hopes of giving the movie a negative rating. But YouTuber Phantom Entertainment has already done a video that sorta debunks this theory. He did the math to figure out how much Disney would have spent buying the empty seats that the theory alleges. He came up with $16,162,500 for the opening weekend. Now, taking that amount from the $155 million that Captain Marvel made on the opening weekend leaves Disney with $137,270,923 profit, meaning Disney would have no real reason to fudge the numbers. Further taken away from this theory is the fact that movies like Solo Star Wars and the 2019 version of Dumbo were both flops, and yet there was no conspiracy or reports of Disney buying up tickets. So why would they for Captain Marvel and not for one of these other movies? It doesn't make sense. So I have to give this one a 1. As I stated, this movie would have still made a ton of money regardless of 25 seats missing per show. Add into the fact that a lot of this theory comes from people with a political agenda, well, it makes it even less believable. Extinct Animal Trading Rings Conspiracy. This theory revolves around an alleged underground trading ring that exists in French-speaking African countries. In that ring, animal body parts, as well as still living animals, that were supposed to be extinct, or animals that have still not been discovered by the larger world, are being traded. These alleged types of animals are an undiscovered ape, as well as prehistoric lizards and dinosaurs. The theory is so obscure that the author of the chart didn't even have much info on the theory, and just doing a little digging online, I can find a ton of info about animal trading rings, but nothing about dinosaurs and undiscovered apes. This one is pretty obscure, and I guess I will give it a believability score of 1. Just because with today's smartphones and the internet, I just can't imagine we live in a world where dinosaurs are being traded, and we don't know about it yet. Oswald wasn't aiming for JFK conspiracy. This one is very intriguing. It contends that there is way more evidence linking Oswald to the assassination attempt of Governor John Connally than there is JFK, and that JFK was hit by mistake, while Connally was hit intentionally. Evidence for this comes from a Secret Service officer named Mike Howard. Shortly after the assassination, he was dispatched to Oswald's apartment. When looking around inside, he would find a little green address book. A heading in all caps said, quote, "I will kill," end quote. And then under this, Oswald had listed 4 men, an FBI agent named James Hosty, a right-wing general named Edwin Walker, former Vice President Richard Nixon, and then the name on the top of the list, Governor of Texas John Connally. And through Connally's name, Oswald had drawn a dagger, with blood drops dripping down. Special Agent Howard turned the book over to the FBI, who gave it to the Warren Commission. Allegedly, later on, Howard would come to find out that the page in the book had been torn out. But if this story is true, what reason did Oswald have for hating Connally? It all started in 1962, when Oswald had went to the Soviet Union to live. He had been honorably discharged by the Marines beforehand. But once he got to Russia, and the Marines learned that he wanted to defect, they downgraded his discharge to undesirable. And when Oswald grew disenchanted with life in the Soviet Union, he wanted to return home. He knew that he would have to get his undesirable discharge from the Marines changed back to honorably discharged, because if he didn't, it would be near impossible for him to get a job. So Oswald was left with only one option, and that was to write a letter, a heartfelt plea actually, to the head of the Naval Department, which is the civilian overseer of the Marines. And who was that? None other than John Connally. But Connally was much too busy for Oswald. He was actually in the process of launching his bid for governor of Texas, so he brushed Oswald off. And Oswald would be proven correct too. It was near impossible for him to get a job. Employers would state later on that when Oswald came in for a job interview, they would ask him about the undesirable discharge. Oswald would then blame Connally. Even Oswald's wife Marina at the Warren Commission would name Connally as her husband's main target, not JFK. There was also testimony that Oswald had no ill will towards Kennedy, and that he even admired him on some political initiatives JFK was pursuing. But the key question exists: why cover it up? There are 2 reasons supposedly. Remember when I mentioned that green notebook that had 4 names, and one of those was FBI agent James Hosty? Turns out Hosty had vigorously grilled Marina Oswald, the wife of Lee Harvey, over her immigration just weeks before the assassination. It's thought that J. Edgar Hoover, the FBI director, did not want his agency to be implicated in pushing Oswald over the edge. In fact, Oswald had left a threatening letter at the Dallas FBI office in early November 1963. Hosted would go on to testify to Congress that on orders from above, he destroyed the letter. Lastly, the new president to take over would be Lyndon B. Johnson. Not only was he a fellow Texan, but him and Connolly were the closest of friends. It's thought that he didn't want his friend to be blamed for the death of JFK. Final rating? I give it a 3. There's just so many conspiracies around JFK that it's impossible to say for sure. I can't possibly make a choice on this one. At this point, I'm not sure anyone really knows what happened that day. Government Giant Bone Suppression Conspiracy. This one asserts that the government, more specifically, the Smithsonian Institute, which is just a group of museums and research centers created by the US government, destroyed thousands of giant skeletons to cover up the truth about the past. The skeletons belonged to a giant race of people that were found in the Midwest. Or so the theory says. It also goes on to say that the Supreme Court was supposed to declassify these documents in 2015, but never did. This all started from a World News Daily Report article in 2014 called Smithsonian Admits to Destruction of Thousands of Giant Human Skeletons in the Early 1900s. It alleged that the reason for the suppression was to protect the mainstream chronology of human evolution. However, it should be pointed out that the World News Daily Reports has a disclaimer on their website that states that they are a news and political satire website. Looking back in time reveals that this is not a new thing either. Newspaper clippings from back in the late 1800s document a multitude of instances when citizens from small unpopulated areas would claim to have found massive bones of humans. They would then report this to the media and authorities, only to receive a visit from the Smithsonian, who would take the bones and tell them that they were going to be displayed at a museum, only for them to disappear. So the rating on this one? I'm sorry, but I have to give this a 1. I know some people really buy into this theory, but the websites that these stories come from are usually satire sites, while the newspaper articles from the early 1900s can be taken with a grain of salt, as papers back then were very prone to yellow journalism. Edison covered up original video camera conspiracy. I don't really view this one as obscure, as I think a lot of people have heard this, but in 1888, the famous inventor Thomas Edison was working on plans to build a camera that could record moving images on a reel of photographic film. But as Edison was starting his work, a French artist seemed to have beaten him to the punch. That man, named Louis Le Prince, had already built a single lens camera, and in 1888, had already used it to make the first recording of a motion film. That movie, called Round Hay Garden Scene, which is only a couple seconds long, should have been proof enough to credit Prince with creating the first movie camera. However, this is where the conspiracy comes in. Le Prince was about to patent his 1889 camera in the UK, and then leave Europe to take it to an exhibition in New York. Before he left, however, he returned to France to visit his brother. After his visit, he would board the train again to head back to Paris, where he would then head to the UK. However, he was never seen again. His bags would show up in Paris when the train stopped, but there was no sign of Le Prince. His family, along with the French police and Scotland Yard, launched exhaustive searches, but no sign of him was ever found. This led to a number of wild theories, but the one related to our conspiracy is that Thomas Edison had Le Prince killed before he could patent his camera. Le Prince's family had suspicions that Edison was responsible for his disappearance. It should be stated, however, that authorities were never able to find any proof for this. Not long after he vanished, Thomas Edison came in and took credit for creating the camera. But Le Prince's widow and son fought to keep his name alive. His son appeared in a court case against Edison, and footage was shown as evidence that proved Edison was not the first inventor. But it didn't matter. The court did side with Edison, and as a result, he got royalties for uses of film moving forward. This would be overturned a year later. But Edison would be forever linked to the motion picture industry for many years, and Le Prince's legacy died. It wouldn't be until the past couple of decades that he would be recognized as the true inventor of the video camera. Most experts think that Le Prince probably committed suicide, since he was under crushing debt. But the question remains, is it possible that Edison had him murdered instead? I give this one a 4 out of 5 on the believability scale. I've never really heard a positive story about Edison. He seemed to be ruthless. He even paid thugs to destroy movie studios that didn't pay him a fee for the right to make a movie in the early days. He is the whole reason that film sets moved from New Jersey to Hollywood. And don't forget, he recorded the electrocution of an elephant and played it in theaters. So yeah, I can totally see him making someone disappear. Authorship Question Conspiracy. The Authorship Question, or more appropriately known as the Shakespeare Authorship Question, is a conspiracy that someone other than Shakespeare wrote the works that were attributed to him. Proponents of this conspiracy argue that Shakespeare instead was a front to shield the identity of the real author or authors. The reason these authors wanted to remain hidden vary, but it's usually something like due to their social rank or gender, or just wanting to avoid making the government mad that they didn't want to be publicly tied to the works. So this person, or persons, allowed Shakespeare to take the credit. This idea has gained much of the literature world's attention, but most literary historians consider it a fringe theory. The authorship of Shakespeare is not a new conspiracy though. It was first questioned in the middle of the 19th century. As more and more people were starting to claim that Shakespeare was the greatest writer of all time, others could not believe that someone with such humble origins and such an obscure life could be such a literary genius. This theory has been around so long that there's literature based on the controversy. Plus, there's over 80 candidates said to be the real Shakespeare, Sir Francis Bacon being the most popular one. While others believe that Shakespeare was the manager or agent of a 7-man team of writers, supporters also point out Shakespeare had no documented education anywhere. When he died, they didn't even find books in his home. Even worse, when he died, there's little evidence that anyone knew. There wasn't a big deal made about it. They also insist that he never appeared at the royal court, where most of his plays took place. But skeptics point out there's a ton of documented evidence that supports Shakespeare's authorship, including some official records. His authorship was also never questioned during his lifetime, while also pointing out that we don't know much about Shakespeare's personal life, which leaves openings for proponents of this theory to make up whatever they want about the author of the writings. As for his lack of education, well, he actually lived about a half a mile from King's New School, which was free to students. They taught grammar as well as classics and rhetoric. Also, the instructors were Oxford graduates, and it's true that there's no document saying Shakespeare attended there, but that's because there's no documents that record that any student went there. They've all been lost to time, but it's very likely Shakespeare did attend this school. Surprisingly, this conspiracy runs very deep, and I could go back and forth all day. I mean, not only is there an absurd amount of pages about the conspiracy, there's just as many debating who the real writer was, and many other pages just telling the history of how and when people started saying Shakespeare was not the real author. It's insane, and I just gotta give this one a 1 out of 5. It's just too dumb for me. Or maybe I'm too dumb for it. Regardless, I'm moving on. Taylor paid Kanye for 2009 VMA incident conspiracy. This theory looks at the possibility that Taylor Swift paid Kanye to interrupt her 2009 VMA acceptance speech to help her in her career. I wasn't able to find much about this anywhere online. I mean, there's tons of talk about the incident itself, but I don't see much discussion or argument in defense of this theory. The only thing even remotely close is Kanye has since made statements, as well as lyrics in his songs, that he made Taylor famous. One fact going against this theory, though, is Taylor was doing pretty good for herself before Kanye came along. In 2006, her first album sold almost 5 million albums, along with almost 11 million digital song sales. Her next album, which came out in late 2008, would go on to be the best-selling album of 2009 in wake of the Kanye incident, but it only netted about 1 more million album sales and 4 more million digital song sales. So if she did pay Kanye, the gains from it were not that huge. It's just possible that she would have sold close to that many without the incident. Besides, Kanye has way more money than Swift, so it's not likely she could have paid an amount to get him to do it. Finally, there's the proof that this feud hasn't ended. Although Kanye has apologized several times, he has almost always backtracked and found a new way to insult her. Plus, Kanye is a bit unpredictable, so what he did in 2009 VMAs was not really a surprise. He is just crazy. However, he is not as crazy as the people who say Taylor Swift is better than Lana Del Rey. I mean, come on people. Lana is a once-in-a-century talent. As far as the score goes, I gotta give it a 1. This one is just too unbelievable. 9/11 Fifth Plane Conspiracy Theory. There are numerous 9/11 conspiracy theories, but the one most grounded in reality is this one. The theory basically alleges there was a fifth plane that was supposed to be used to coordinate another attack somewhere else, but because of a call from the radio tower ordering all flights to stay grounded, it was never able to complete its objective. Most of our testimony on this comes from one person, and a well-respected person at that. The late Major General Carol Timmons, who was also the first female general in Delaware National Guard history, She was first officer aboard United Airlines Flight 23 the morning of September 11th. The airliner had been set to go from JFK Airport to LA. It had already started slowly making itself down the runway when the radio tower called and told them to cancel the flight and to secure the cockpit door. Timmons and Captain Thomas Manello were both surprised. It would be a few minutes later when they heard of the World Trade Center attacks. Captain Manello would then grab the aircraft's crash axe and barricade the cockpit door. They would then be told by the control towers that they were completely shutting down the airport for safety measures and that the pilots were on their own. Luckily, since they were not in the air, all they had to do was drive the plane back around to the terminal. It was at this moment that some of the cabin crew, who were now barricaded on the other side of the cockpit, would contact Timmons, quote, "We've got some guys back here that are very agitated that we're going back, and that we're not taking off, and they look Middle Eastern," end quote. Even more suspicious, when the aircraft returned to the terminal, the four men would flee. Timmons would state, quote, "It was total chaos at the airport, and they just disappeared into the crowd, and there was nothing we could do," end quote. After things calmed down some, the flight crew would look over the airplane and find that the four men had left their bags. Inside they found box cutters, along with documents that linked them to Al-Qaeda. Captain Manello would actually confirm later on that during his interview with the FBI, the agent told him, quote, "There were actually 7 Arabs or Muslims who might have been Saudis on the plane. There were a couple, with a 2 or 3-year-old baby. We're looking for the other 4 gentlemen," end quote. A lot of this incident kinda got drowned out in the 24/7 coverage of the actual 9/11 attacks, but there were a few isolated reports, such as the CNN report that mentioned 4 people were taken in for questioning related to the attacks, but were later released. While 2 days later, on September 13th, news broke that the New York authorities had arrested 10 Middle Easterners at JFK and LaGuardia Airport for fears of another hijacking. The New York Times would write, quote, "Law enforcement officials said one of those held was carrying a false pilot's identification. Furthermore, several of the detained men showed up at the airport with tickets for flights canceled on Tuesday, September 11th, and tried to use them. Investigators say they believe one of the men had been among a group of passengers that behaved suspiciously and become aggressive after their aircraft, United Airlines Flight 23, had its takeoff canceled on the morning of 9/11. Some of the detained had false passports, knives, and one even tried to board a flight dressed as a pilot," end quote. This has all led to a grand conspiracy that a 5th plane was indeed supposed to be part of the attacks. Where is unknown, as the FBI has been tight-lipped about it. In fact, the US government seems to have just ignored it. For many years, it was known as another 9/11 myth, but Carol Timmons and Captain Manello had no reason to lie. So if it is true, why has the government never wanted to report the incident? Why did the commission not mention it in their report? Was it to keep the public from panicking? Was it because they were trying to capture the other 4 individuals? Or was it for another reason? Well, it's just possible that there was never a 5th attack planned, and what transpired was more due to initial panic by the aircrew, as well as the passengers. A man named Miles Carroll was actually a staff member that served on the 9/11 Commission, and he would do an interview after the report came out. He would state the plot, quote, "does not have room for a 5th plane, nor does a 5th plane from yet another airport make sense. My initial take on UA-23 is that the 4 passengers panicked and fled, an unrelated event," end quote. Further giving credence to this is the fact that United Airlines 23 was not scheduled to depart for another hour after the other flights, as the first plane took off at 7:45, followed by 2 departing at 8 a.m., and the final one leaving at 8:10 a.m. United Airlines 23 was not scheduled to depart until 9 a.m. It's not likely the hijackers would knowingly schedule the last attack an hour later, knowing good and well that once the news spread, that all the flights would have been grounded. Secondly, Timmons herself said that when they returned, it was total chaos, as everyone was trying to get off the plane. Remember, at the time, the airport had been closed for safety measures, so if JFK Airport thought that they were a possible target, then it's reasonable to see why all the passengers, not just the 4 Arabs, were in a hurry to get off the plane. This one is a very difficult one to score, but I'm going to give it a 4. I have to believe Captain Manello and First Officer Timmons. If they believed they were under threat, it's good enough for me. Titanic Found in the 1970s Conspiracy. The official telling of the discovery of the Titanic states that it was found in 1985, when Jean-Louis Michel and Robert Ballard led a French-American expedition that uncovered the long-lost ship. But could it have been found earlier? It's long been rumored that the wreck of the Titanic was first found and photographed sometime in the 70s, and that the information was given to Ballard, who then went to the site officially to discover it in 1985. But who would do that and why? Well, the conspiracy is very long, convoluted, and has a lot of moving parts, so I will try to condense it down the best I can. As the story goes, on September 1st, 1985, Jean-Louis Michel and Dr. Robert Ballard would trawl a camera package over a portion of the North Atlantic seabed in search of the Titanic. After weeks of searching, they would finally find a massive ship buoyer. This, of course, was from the Titanic, and the two men would go down in history as being the discoverers of the lost ship. And here's where the conspiracy starts. As Dr. Ballard states in his book, that when he went to call the Oceanographic Institute, and quote, "When I called to give them the news, I was met with a jolt. The guard who answered the phone informed me that the press had been calling all morning, wanting details of our Titanic discovery. Apparently, there had been a story in the Sunday London Observer. If that was true, the paper had gone to press about the time we had found the ship. Impossible. Or had someone been eavesdropping on our radio conversations between control room and the bridge?" End quote. So as you can see, immediately things are weird. How did everyone know about the discovery before Ballard even called it in? Furthermore, how had a newspaper in Britain printed the story at the same time that the crew had found the Titanic? Ballard would never try to explain this, and in later years, he would start to make jokes that Britain's intelligence services must have had psychics on their payroll. So what really happened? According to the theory, in 1977, the British were conducting a top-secret test called Solace Project, which was testing new deep-sea underwater sonar equipment, which was to be used in locating and detecting Russian nuclear subs. It is now known that the Russian submarines were hiding in the deep waters off the North Atlantic coast around New Brunswick and Greenland. During one of these tests in 1977, the new deep underwater sonar found two very large metallic objects that were located in the general vicinity and depth where Dr. Ballard located the wreck in '85. But since it was at the height of the Cold War, the US and Britain didn't want the Russians to know how sophisticated their new deep-sea underwater sonar equipment had become. So the information on the possible discovery of the Titanic was marked as classified and put away. Shortly after that, Dr. Ballard, who was former US Army and Navy, would start the process of trying to raise money for an expedition to locate the Titanic in the exact area where the British sonar equipment had detected the large metallic objects. It's thought that his connections within the US military told him about the location. And although he wasn't able to raise money to actually launch the expedition, he would partner with the US Navy in 1985. And now during the height of the Cold War, the US wanted to show Russia how advanced their sonar and imaging tech had become. So now Ballard was sent out to locate the Titanic, even though he was already told where it was. It really ended up just being a way to show Russia in front of the world that the US/UK could find any submarine at any depth. As far as how the British newspaper Observer was able to release the story a day ahead of time, that can be explained too. Even though the US and UK relations were and are still very close to this day, at the time, there was a little tension, as the UK Navy had taken offense to a comment from a higher up in the US Navy when he said the Brits, quote, had a third-rate Navy, end quote. Supposedly, this led to the Brits shadowing the expedition, and when they seen that Ballard was about to announce the finding of the Titanic, they notified the Observer to embarrass the US, as well as to show the US Navy they were just as capable as the US fleet. It was also intentional that they chose the paper called Observer to let the US know they had been observed. Finally, as mentioned previously, there was a photograph supposedly taken in 1977. That goes back to the British destroyer, HMS Hecate, that originally conducted the deep-sea sonar test. 4 sailors from that crew have stated that a classified sonar image of the Titanic does exist. More specifically, It's of the two large metallic objects on the ocean floor where Dr. Ballard found the wreck. It is subject to be declassified in 2027. Like I said, the story gets way more convoluted and goes deeper, but that's the gist of it. The counter to this claim is the UK has said they never had an operation called Project Solace. Also, the ship HMS Hecate that allegedly was doing these tests was not even in the Northern Atlantic in 1977, or according to the Royal Navy at least. Finally, the UK has dismissed the entire story as a fabrication. So what score do I give this long, confusing conspiracy theory? I'm gonna go with a 4. Only because it was at the height of the Cold War, and I could totally see this all being played out this way. Patterson-Gimlin Massacre Conspiracy. The Patterson-Gimlin film, better known as That One Sasquatch Video, is basically the only Bigfoot video that has never been totally disproven. It is a legend in the cryptid community, and almost everyone has seen it. The story goes that Patterson and Gimlin were riding northeast along the bank of Bluff Creek between 1:15 and 1:40 p.m. They rounded an overturned tree and saw a logjam left over from a flood in 1964. They would then see a figure behind it in the distance. It stood on the other side of the creek on the bank. The film then shows the creature walk off, but the conspiracy theory that we're discussing disputes that version of events, and instead offers a different account, a much darker account. Supposedly, Patterson and Gimlin did not encounter the one and only female Sasquatch that day. According to this conspiracy, Gimlin and Patterson had spotted several Sasquatch, and their response was to immediately shoot and kill them. They would then go get a backhoe to use in burying the bodies. The main evidence for this theory comes from a video taken at the site afterwards. During the filming, a pool of liquid is caught in the camera's view. Most write this off as water, but proponents of this theory claim it's blood. There's also differing accounts of this story. There's one that says it wasn't just Gimlin and Patterson, but instead a party of 8 men. The film starts off with a few of the creatures digging for something. They are far away and start to walk down a trail to a pond. They separate, but then they regroup. Then all of a sudden, a hail of gunfire opens up on the creatures. One dies immediately, the other runs off. The last one walks or staggers off. That is the one said to be the one in the Patterson-Gimlin film. But on this 50 seconds of film that allegedly exists, there is supposed to be a scene where the men are dragging lifeless bodies and placing them on a tarp, only to be seen cutting up numerous Sasquatch, as well as the film supposedly begins with footage of a dead Bigfoot in a freshly dug grave. The films were then allegedly taken and tucked away in a safe deposit box somewhere in Sonoma, California, and they remain there to this day. The men supposedly only hid the video for fear of going to prison. The proof against this, outside of the ridiculousness of it all, is that only one man has really pushed this theory, and that is M.K. Davis, and he doesn't have the greatest of reputations. He is an outcast, even in the cryptid world, and almost everyone completely dismisses him. At times, he's claimed to have seen the footage, while other times he's claimed to have been in possession of it, but he has never produced anything to prove these claims. As for the so-called blood on the video, that can be explained in different ways. The video quality on cameras back then wasn't that great anyways, so the sunlight could have caused that puddle to look red. Furthermore, there's plenty of natural causes in the woods that can give water a reddish tint. Finally, why would Patty, the one in the Patterson-Gimlin film, just stand around watching the massacre before finally walking off? Was she just wanting a few seconds of fame? This is supposed to be a creature that is fairly intelligent. I give this one a 1. I wish I could give it a 0, but I already made the scale. The premise is totally stupid, and just takes away the little credibility that Bigfoot has. Uncanny Valley Predator Conspiracy. Have you ever seen a very realistic looking robot, or even a doll, and thought, man, that is so creepy? Well, there's a reason for that, and it's called Uncanny Valley. The name Uncanny Valley comes from the uncanny or strange feelings it provokes, while the valley part denotes the dip in affection a human has for a robot the more human it begins to look. As the robot begins to look less human, the more positive humans feel about it. There are several theories as to why this may be, ranging from mate selection to our fear of death, but we're going to look at the conspiracy part of this theory, the one that mainstream scientists reject, and that is, What if we are creeped out by these very human-looking robots, because at some point in our distant past, we had to run from some type of human-looking creature because we were their prey? What if the threat from these things was so dangerous that it imprinted on our genetics, thus making us uneasy around human-looking robots today? Or really, anything that looks really human but isn't, like a doll. It's not unlike the same process that made humans fear snakes, really. So if this theory is true, just what in the world was this human-looking creature that preyed on our ancestors? That's where the info for this theory kinda dries up. Although it's often suggested that it could be a skinwalker. So what do I score this on the believability chart? I think a 2 works. It's a very interesting theory, and could very well be true, but Uncanny Valley could also be caused by a variety of other things. George Lucas' Secret Films Conspiracy. After Star Wars was sold to Disney in 2012, Lucas said he was going to retire, and other than writing the CGI film Strange Magic and doing some consultation, he's mostly retired. However, Lucas has said that he has been making private films on occasion. This, of course, makes Star Wars fans super curious, and theories have ranged wide, speculating over what he might be working on. The most popular one seems to be a privately made CGI for his original plan for the sequel trilogy. I couldn't find much info about this one, nor am I particularly interested. Not much of a Star Wars fan. However, I'll give the theory a 3, cause why not? Jordan LeBron footage cover-up. The author for this chart must have been a basketball fan, or a Jordan fan, as this is the second basketball-related conspiracy already. The conspiracy states that around the year 2000, Jordan played a 16-year-old LeBron, and LeBron ended up being way better than Jordan. And then once LeBron entered the NBA and started to rival Jordan as the greatest player of all time, Jordan used his wealth to have the game covered up. Allegedly, this is the only pitcher to survive from that game. However, this has already been debunked by LeBron himself. When the interviewer asked LeBron if the pitcher in question came from that game in 2000.
There's a photo circulating, social media universe of you and Mike on the court. Do you know if that was that run? Is that camp maybe? Where the photo's from?
that is Santa Barbara. That is Santa Barbara. That's Michael Jordan's camp in Santa Barbara. We were on the same team then.
Gotta give this one a 1. Unless you're just willing to believe that LeBron is part of the cover-up, then this one doesn't make sense. Gangsters Ghostwrite mob films conspiracy. I actually heard about this one several years ago, but never really researched it. It is a well-known fact that the mob has had its fingers in the film industry ever since the film industry started. Robert De Niro was even photographed with his arm around Anthony Ruggiano, who worked for the Gambino crime family, and Lenny Montana, who worked for the Colombo crime family, landed a role in the blockbuster film Godfather, so it's not exactly uncommon. However, in my research, I was unable to find any discussion of this, so I'm going to have to give this one a 4. I don't think it would really be that surprising to find out that one of the mob movies was written by a gangster, but without any data even discussing it, I can't give it a 5. Sacred Swords of the Patriots League conspiracy. No, this is not about an online role-playing game. It's actually about a black operation performed by the CIA during the Vietnam War. It involved a combination of psychological warfare along with psychological operations. The purpose was to convince the people and government of North Vietnam that an underground non-communist society existed within North Vietnam, which of course would be big trouble for an already paranoid government. The name Sacred Swords of the Patriot League, which we from now on will call the SSPL, was taken from a very popular story in Vietnam's history. Le Loi was a Vietnamese rebel who would go on to become the first emperor of a restored Vietnam after finally overthrowing the Ming Dynasty of China. Known for his effective guerrilla tactics, he is probably the single greatest hero in Vietnamese history. There are a lot of myths and legends surrounding Le Loi, but the most famous, and the one that the SSPL was named after, is the story of a magic sword he obtained that would eventually help him defeat the Chinese. The story is much like that of King Arthur and his sword Excalibur, and I won't go into all the details of him obtaining it, but after he defeats the Chinese, he takes the sword out to a lake and throws it into the water to return it to the Dragon King, who originally loaned it to him. Countless poems and songs have been written about this, and every schoolchild knows the story, so the planners knew that the SSPL could possibly work if it was built around this legend. The operation involved, firstly, distributing leaflets all over North Vietnam in an attempt to demoralize the enemy. It is thought as many as tens of millions of leaflets were put out. Lots of them would be left on corpses, in an attempt to make the North Vietnamese think that the soldier they had knew was possibly a spy working for the SSPL, which didn't really exist. They also had a radio station in South Vietnam that broadcasted propaganda from the SSPL and was able to make it appear as if the radio station itself was broadcasting from North Vietnam, which of course made their government even more wary about a possible uprising. There was also a campaign of letter writing to important people in the North Vietnamese government to draw suspicion to them. For example, they would send these people letters that concerned their alleged support for the SSPL. Then they would purposely send it in such a way to arouse the North Vietnamese government to snoop into these people's mail and then discover, hey, this guy's working for the SSPL, which of course he really didn't, since it didn't even exist in the first place. But the craziest part of this story is that of Paradise Island, which was an island that sat safely off the coast of South Vietnam. The land here looked much like that of North Vietnam. The South Vietnamese soldiers that were in on this operation would then kidnap fishermen off the coast of North Vietnam and blindfold them. Then they took them back to this island and told them that this was a secret place in North Vietnam, a place that existed outside the communist government control and was ran by the SSPL. They would then treat these fishermen excellent for about 3 weeks, giving them any medical care they needed, plus fattening them up with lots of good food that they rarely ever got to eat. They also got to live in this fake village that had been built, and life looked amazing compared to that of communist North Vietnam. They would then take the fishermen and drop them back off in North Vietnam with gifts, and ask them to spread the message about the SSPL, which they did. Pretty clever, actually. The SSPL did other things too, but these are the most popular. But to be honest, I'm not sure where the conspiracy is. We now know for a fact that this did happen. That's not a conspiracy. Maybe the conspiracy is why it abruptly ended in 1968. Or maybe it's the conspiracy why the US would not allow the military to form a real resistance instead of a fake one. Many of the SSPL supporters claim that bureaucrats killed a great opportunity to overthrow the North Vietnamese government, while also saving countless lives. I can't give this one a score, because I'm not sure why it's on the iceberg. Bella was connected to the Nazis conspiracy. You probably already know the mystery called Who Put Bella Down the Witch Elm, which is a case of 4 kids finding a skeleton of a woman inside a witch elm in Hagley Wood, Worcestershire, England. The murder was thought to have happened in 1941, and it still remains unsolved. They had no idea who the woman was until the following year, when graffiti would be found that said, quote, "Who put Bella down the witch elm," end quote, which has led to the naming of the now infamous case. But getting a name, assuming that was her real name, didn't really help detectives, as they were never able to identify who this person was. But there's been a long-running thought that she was connected to the Nazis in some way. For one, there's a conspiracy that she was actually a Nazi spy, working with a man named Joseph Jacobs, but this has been debunked in recent years. There's another theory that Bella was involved with an informant of a Nazi spy ring, working to determine the location of local munitions factories, which could then be targeted by the Luftwaffe. She ended up being killed by someone of the spy ring for talking too much. One problem with these theories, though, is that there was a substantial reward for information at the time. Lots of people went to detectives with off-the-wall theories, in hopes of just hitting on something that could get them the reward money. And of course, this was at the height of World War II. People in England wanted to blame Nazi spies for her death, as that was a very believable possibility, as well as a deep fear to people living in the UK. This muddied the waters of the early days of the investigation, as well as leaving a permanent hypothetical connection between Bella and the Nazis. My score? I'm leaning 1. It seems the detectives have pretty much always felt strongly that she was a prostitute that was murdered by someone that lived in the area, and that the spy thing was probably all fictionalized. And that is all of Layer 1 and Layer 2 of the most obscure conspiracy theories iceberg. I hope you enjoyed. If you did, kindly let me know in the comments below if you would like to see me finish the rest of this iceberg or not.